Hi everyone. We were going to give you all a couple minutes to still start trickling in, but we're a couple minutes late on our end, so I think we'll probably just get started. You all are seeing a welcome slide, and I am filling in for, I'm obviously not Lilani Nelson unless I look very different. But I'm filling in for Lilani Nelson today. And thank you all for joining us. I am Laurie Bayronovan. I'm the director of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And as I said, I'm filling in for my colleague Lilani Nelson, who would have been joining you. And I'm also joined by Liz Turner, who you can see in the little square up top. She's really the main show for today. She is a visiting professor at Vermont Law and Graduate School and works closely with us in the Center for Ag and Food System and is leading our research on urban agriculture, land use, and food access. And we're really excited today to share with you what we've learned through our urban agriculture and innovative production policy project. Liz is going to talk with you through some of the local policy barriers and strategies that she and the students and the team at CAFS identified along the way. Take a look at some real world case studies, and then also introduce you to a new resource that we've developed that is a local food policy database. Before Liz begins, I just wanted to give you a sense for anybody who's unfamiliar about who we are at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. So we are a research center that's housed at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And alongside our students, we produce original scholarly research that's focused on food and agricultural law and policy that's essentially aimed at serving the broadest range of food system stakeholders. We work with partners at the local, regional, national, and even international level on food system challenges. So, some of the issues that we work on are focused on food and nutrition security and affordability, farmland access, urban agriculture, which you'll hear about today, issues that impact food system workers, institutional food procurement, and various issues related to public health and the food system. We work really closely with our partners to make sure that the resources that we're building are actually responding to needs. And we also provide direct policy and legal technical assistance to individuals and government entities. And I really want to emphasize how students are involved in everything we do. Liz worked really closely with a lot of students at Vermont Law and Graduate School on this particular project, and they access our work through our food and agriculture clinic or through our research assistant program. They also get to work alongside our partners and engage in real work that spans the whole food system. So some of the the student involvement in CAFS connects to the broader academic programs that we also offer at Vermont Law and Graduate School. The picture that you all see here on the slide is of students in our food and agriculture clinic, where they get hands-on experience working on live projects with partners in the food system. We also offer a JD concentration in food and agricultural law and policy for students earning their law degree, a food and agriculture policy track on alongside our master's in public policy program, and then an LLM in food and agriculture for people who already hold a law degree but want to specialize even further. All of these are also available through our online degree programs, so students don't actually have to move to the bustling campus in South Royalton to be able to take part. And some of our research assistants are students that participate in the online program, so we are able to accommodate them in that way. So now I'm going to hand it off to Liz to talk more with you about what you're really interested in hearing about today. And I will be monitoring the the chat feature for questions. So if you, Liz is open to taking questions during the presentation. If you have a burning question that comes up, pop it in the chat. If there's a point that feels like a good break, then I'll ask Liz. But otherwise, we'll take a bunch of questions at the end.
Thanks, Lori. So as Lori said, my name is Liz Turner. I'm a visiting assistant professor here at CAFS and Vermont Law and Graduate School. This project that I'll be presenting on, I worked really closely with my colleague Lilani Nelson on. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but just know that she was a major force behind the scenes in putting all this work together. Um, we're going to go through a little bit of project background, how this project came together and what our kind of aims and methods were. Then we're going to talk about some of the key topics and examples that came up during our research process and that we're publishing resources on in a sort of ongoing fashion. And then, as Lori mentioned, I'm going to talk through a little bit, and this is where I'm really sad that Lonnie's not here because this has been her baby, especially our new online resource, which is called the Local Food Policy Database. And then, as Lori said, we'll take a little time at the end for some questions. So this project was kicked off almost exactly 3 years ago, and was originally or was prompted by a cooperative agreement with the USDA's Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production. OUIP, as the as the acronym goes, was established by the 2018 Farm Bill as a sort of intra-agency hub within USDA to address the unique concerns of urban farmers. The office's original statutory mandate in that 2018 Farm Bill included a directive to develop educational materials for farmers on urban farmers, specifically on local policies that impact their work. And we were awarded a cooperative agreement with that office to sort of carry out that piece of their mandate. Pursuant to that agreement, we focused our research on the 17 cities that OUIP had originally identified as urban agriculture hubs throughout the country. So these aren't necessarily like the cities, I mean, some of them are, but these aren't necessarily the cities that are sort of doing the most urban agriculture or that have the most developed policy landscape. In the country, there are plenty of other cities who are doing interesting things that that fell outside of this scope. But it did provide an interesting snapshot and a useful snapshot of cities in a bunch of different stages of policy development, with a bunch of different sort of resource concerns, different size cities, different geographies, all those things. So it ended up turning out to be a pretty useful kind of constraining mechanism on our research. Over the course of our research, we started out by doing a lot of bench research, so looking through the policies that are on the books, reading through what cities are saying essentially and what regulations they've actually passed about regarding urban agriculture. And then we moved on from there to conduct more than 120 interviews with stakeholders in each of these cities about how those policies play out on the ground. So that was a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of actually seeing how the sort of written policy language and the intentions of the cities translates into an on-the-ground experience for both urban farmers and other folks living in the city around them. And as Lori said, we had students involved in every single part of this process. I think more than 20 students ended up working at some capacity on the project. And they did interviews, they did research, they also did some writing. So there are a few students who are credited as co-authors in various pieces of this project as well. So our first big deliverable from the project was this Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production Guide, which we published a few months ago, last October. In addition to that guide, we published a series of fact sheets, which are kind of one-page sort of executive summaries of each of the chapters of the larger guide, which address individual policy topics. We're also publishing, still in the in the process of publishing case studies that talk about sort of individual stories of how cities have addressed some of these policy issues, develop new policies that creatively address some of these challenges that we see repeating over and over again in various cities throughout the country. We'll get into those more in detail a little later on in the presentation. And then we've also publishing this local food policy. We've also published this local food policy resource hub, which is a website that collects both a lot of the policies that we identified as being important for urban agriculture regulation at the local level, but also broader food systems policies that have been collected through previous iterations of local food systems research here at CAFS, most notably the Healthy Food Policy Project. Some of you may be familiar with that. So we've got a big searchable policy database on this website, as well as a resource library that collects both our own research and publications on local food systems, as well as some of our partners and friends in other places around the country. And then we've got a few things still coming down the pipeline. So we've got one more case study left to publish on brownfields work that's happening in Phoenix. We're also publishing a series of best practices sheets, which will be sort of more practically focused guides to how to develop some of these local policies that have been so important to urban agriculture. And this was sort of our guiding policy question. So throughout the process of developing the project, of doing the research, of developing the resources, we were asking ourselves, how can local law and policy support urban agriculture? In many cases, as we'll see as we go through, local law and policy has overlooked urban agriculture or has imposed barriers or regulations that create unnecessary sort of hoops for urban farmers and gardeners to jump through. So while we were taking a close look at those more prohibitive policies, we were also looking at ways that cities can develop policy that truly supports growing food within urban environments. So through these original stages of research, we identified these kind of major buckets of policy types that are the most impactful for urban farmers and gardeners. Those are land access, so the ability to not only get onto land in order to grow food, but also to hang on to that land, feel secure in land tenure. The second bucket is zoning and land use, so the rules and regulations that govern how you use that land once you've secured it. The third is city governance and public funding. So taking a look at how cities are organizing themselves and developing sort of internal systems to govern and support urban agriculture and to fund urban agriculture programs. We also took a look at water access. Obviously, if you're growing food, you not only need space to grow it, you need water to grow it. And getting access to water within an urban environment can be a little more complicated than just drilling a well. So water access is a big piece of the puzzle. We took a look at policies that support soil health and composting, particularly sort of on-site composting and other soil building practices. And then innovative production, which is this sort of catch-all term for agriculture that is not sort of traditional in soil, like open air agriculture. So it can be anything from growing in a season extension structure like a greenhouse or hoop house, growing on a rooftop, which happens in many cities, to more sort of high-tech agriculture techniques like controlled environment agriculture, hydroponics, aquaponics, these systems that require that look really different from just growing a plant in the ground. Laurie, have any questions? I'm going to take a break here to see if any questions have popped up, and if not, we can move into land access.
No questions so far, but I did notice that Christina Karam and Travis Rosenbluth are attendees. So it's
Oh.
nice to have some of our students that worked on this.
Yeah, Christina and Travis were both, Travis was one of the first students who worked on this project actually, and Christina came a little later, but it was a really important piece of the puzzle. Great. Okay, so we're going to get started with land access. So land access is an important issue for any kind of farmer. It's sort of the number one thing that any farmer identifies as necessary to their viability, to their operation. But a lot of those land access dynamics are made even more complex in urban environments. So land access in cities is pretty unaffordable. There may not be many pieces of land available for growing food. Um, Lots of other things that are sort of really different in urban environments from the way that accessing land looks in more rural places. And we broke these land access policies down into strategies that support public land access, so allowing farmers and gardeners to access land that's held by the city or held by a local government. That might look like parkland or schoolyards. It could also look like um, parcels that have come into the city's inventory through processes like tax foreclosure. And we also took a look at incentives that cities can provide to encourage private landowners to provide land for urban agriculture. Um, this land access research has led to continued research on land banks, which are sort of unique quasi-governmental entities that hold land, usually tax foreclosed land, and clear the title or back taxes on it and then make it available for public purposes. We've got there's some other sort of types of policy interventions that are addressed both in the guide and in some of our follow-up materials. As a case study here, we took a look at Philadelphia, which is a city where there are quite a few longstanding urban farms and community gardens that have made use of vacant or abandoned land within the city. This is a pretty common phenomenon within urban agriculture, particularly during the kind of like 80s and 90s, the beginning years of the kind of modern urban agriculture movement as cities saw population shifts and demographic shifts. Some neighborhoods got emptied out of people for lots of different reasons. Um, and people who remained in those communities saw an opportunity in this uh, amount of vacant or abandoned land to grow food for themselves. So there are, in the case of Philadelphia, there are dozens of these gardens that many of which have been in place for decades at this point, who have taken advantage of land that was abandoned by an owner to develop these really vibrant community assets that have become really beloved and sort of important to the urban fabric of Philadelphia. Um, but as Philadelphia has grown, times have changed. We've seen that development pressure has come to some of these neighborhoods that previously had a large amount of vacant or abandoned land. And there's a legal process. You might know it as squatters' rights. The technical legal term is adverse possession, through which people who have been making productive use of land that the owner has been kind of absentee or not paying attention to can assert a claim to that land and gain a legal title to that land. And each state sets their own adverse possession sort of statute of limitations. So in some states it's 7 years, in some states it's 50 years. Philadelphia's was 21 years, I believe. Um, and that not only means that you have to have been continually stewarding that land for those 21 years, but when you go to court to try to settle the title in your favor, you have to provide evidence, documentation that you've been doing it for 21 years. So that can be really challenging in some of these places where it maybe was an informal organization of neighbors who were tending it, or there weren't phones that made it possible to document some of the gardening in the early years. So there are these gardens that were really under threat from being repossessed, developed, that were really beloved and well-used community assets. So the folks who tended these gardens, as well as some lawyers and other community members in Philadelphia, banded together with local and state lawmakers to develop a policy change to help support these gardens in asserting a legal claim over these parcels. They did that by amending the state adverse possession law to reduce the statute of limitations on adverse possession claims from 21 years to 10 years. Um, so this is, it's not a sort of traditional land access strategy necessarily, but it did offer a pathway for these gardens, these really well-used, beloved community spaces to secure land tenure on the plots that they'd been taking care of for such a long time. You can read more about it in the case study. Our second major topic area was land access or was zoning and land use. So zoning, which is the system of local land use regulation, essentially the rules that cities develop to govern what people can do on parcels in various areas of the city. And a lot of zoning was developed in the sort of like first half of the 20th century, and many of those rules are still on the books. At a time where agriculture was really thought of as something that happened outside of the city. So there had been sort of waves in the early part of the 20th century of growing food in cities through like victory gardens and relief gardens during the Depression, other kinds of urban programs that encouraged agriculture within cities. But by the time a lot of city zoning codes were really being developed or had been most recently amended at any rate, agriculture had sort of moved back out to the country, and the city was thought of as a place where you shouldn't be growing food, essentially. So one of the primary barriers that a lot of growers face in urban environments is that either a city zoning code does not at all address urban agriculture, so they don't know whether or not they're allowed to do what they're trying to do, or it really heavily restricts urban agriculture activities. So that can look like anything from ordinances like weed overgrowth ordinances that say, you can only have plants in your yard that are in any given parcel in a city that are up to 8 or 10 inches high. So that obviously rules out a lot of garden plants. Or regulations against, selling products out of your home or out of residential parcels, things like that. Um, so zoning codes have understandably been kind of one of the first sort of battlefields of urban ag policy reform over the last 15 years or so. There was a major wave of zoning ordinances that were passed in the like late 2000s, early 2010s. And there have been continual updates to a lot of zoning ordinances around the country that include more urban agriculture uses. Um, and a lot of the interventions there that we've seen are just including urban agriculture at all, and really addressing these common agricultural uses such as keeping chickens or having a compost pile or building a shed or a greenhouse on site. Um, really common sense reforms that are mostly just about establishing clarity within zoning codes. Um, these are a couple of things that really rose to the fore as really common zoning issues. So the first is rules around accessory structures. So these are things like sheds, hoop houses, or greenhouses, or high tunnels, season extension structures like the one you see in this photo, smaller buildings like farm stands. These are all buildings that might be really integral to a farm or garden's operation, but are sort of like in a uh, not exactly a gray area, but don't exactly meet the same or need the same like heightened building standards as a building like a home or a garage does. If it's just something like a hoop house that's essentially like a bent PVC pipe with plastic stretched across it. So these structures might be subject to really rigorous standards around building safety that are not relevant to the type of structure that they are. Um, there are lots of other ways that these structures are sort of unnecessarily regulated or really heavily regulated within zoning and building codes that make it really challenging for urban farmers and gardeners to develop the infrastructure they need on farm to really make their garden or farm successful. We also see a lot of issues around code enforcement. So the zoning code is written, it's put into place, and then there are city employees generally that go around and enforce that zoning code. So That's usually some kind of ticket or fine. Sometimes those tickets or fines can snowball into some kind of more significant penalty. But often the issue is just that code enforcement officials are not well trained to recognize urban agriculture activities or to understand how they might be treated differently under a zoning code than normal sort of overgrown yard or abandoned lot. So they may issue fines or penalties, even if the zoning code allows the activity in question, that are then really can be, burdensome, annoying, or in the worst cases, if you don't pay a fine, the city can come after you for various things. Um, so this is a major source of headache and sometimes, financial concern um, or worse for urban gardeners and farmers. For our case study for zoning, we took a look at Detroit. So Detroit, many of you may know, is a real leader in the urban agriculture space. There are more than 2,000 farms and gardens in the city of Detroit. Some of them are really big and really impressive. Um, but the city, back in 2013, passed a zoning ordinance that sort of caught up to what was already going on in the city, allowed a lot of sort of, the standard kind of vegetable growing, orchard type activities. But there was a companion ordinance that addressed livestock keeping that did not pass at that time and was tabled. And over the succeeding or the following decade, more than a decade, there were farmers and gardeners and folks who were doing kind of urban homesteading in the city who continued to push the city to develop rules around urban livestock. There were also folks within the planning department who sort of kept the flame alive and kept trying to push for some kind of common sense regulation that allowed folks within the city to keep animals at the appropriate scale. And finally, in 2025, or I guess it was technically passed in 2024, but Detroit passed an animal keeping ordinance that allows Detroit residents to keep poultry and bees. I think it's limited to 6 chickens or ducks on like a normal residential lot, and you can scale it up a little bit if you have more property, and you can have at least 2 beehives on your property. So this wasn't necessarily responsive to farmers who are calling for commercial scale animal keeping, but it was sort of a step in the right direction in the perspective of a lot of people to um, making sure that the rules were clear and that people were able to keep poultry and bees, which helped to establish a certain level of at least personal food security or family level food security. Um, Topic 3, which is chapter 4, is city governance and public funding. So this again is the way that cities organize themselves, develop staff and governance structures, and funding streams that support or yeah, support urban agriculture, urban farmers. Um, as you'll see, a common theme in a lot of these slides is that cities just haven't really thought about urban agriculture or developed policy at all around urban agriculture. Um, it can also be seen as kind of like an extra program or policy type. So it can be really vulnerable to budget cuts, lack of funding, political changes. One mayor might think that it's really important, and then the mayor who's elected next might not, and might just sort of disband the program. So we took a look at various sort of issues within how those programs are developed and how those funding streams are developed. Um, Again, a lot of the sort of strategies that we saw that have been really successful are just including urban agriculture. So creating an urban agriculture office, hiring staff that are dedicated to urban agriculture. There are at this point, I think, dozens of cities around the country who have some kind of urban agriculture staff person, but we really see the importance of those folks in helping to both work with community and also work with their colleagues within city government to sort of understand the needs of urban growers. They also generally both do program administration and some kind of policy work. So that can look like working with a policy council. It can look like making policy recommendations to city council on their own or if after community engagement. And they also just serve as a really important sort of like touch point for both city staff and urban farmers and gardeners. For our case study here, we took a look at New Orleans, which hired a urban agriculture liaison a couple years ago. There were quite a few urban farmers and gardeners in New Orleans, and they were facing a lot of challenges navigating municipal processes, a lot of opaque, ways to get the permits they needed or to challenge citations that they thought were unjust or lots of other things that they just didn't know sort of where to go in the city to get their needs addressed. So there was a group of growers and other food system organizations within the city that built a campaign to push the city to enact policy reforms that would make the city a more friendly place to practice urban agriculture. And one of those recommendations in the campaign was to hire an urban agriculture staff person. And that was actually the first one that the city acted on. So they hired an urban agriculture liaison in October of 2024. She's been in place for almost 2 years now. And part of her job is really robust community engagement. She works with a council of community members who can, chime in, speak up, and let her know what their needs are. And she can bring those before city council or before the planning department within the city. She also helps sort of troubleshoot issues that farmers and gardeners face with people like the water authority or the code enforcement folks. So she's really been able to be this really valuable link between producers within the city and city government. Water is another really important precondition to growing food in cities. But unlike in more rural areas, accessing water within the city means interacting generally with a water utility. And that water utility may or may not be a part of city government. So that's an additional kind of level of challenge here. Sometimes water utilities are structured as their own units of local government that has different territorial boundaries than just a city or a county even. But the number one sort of issue with that urban growers face with these water utilities is that they are not treated differently from residential water customers. So they both are subject to residential water rates, which can be really high and often include like a built-in sewerage charge, which is unnecessary if you're putting water into the ground and not into a sewer system. The connection into water systems can be really expensive. In some places, it's $50,000. In most places, it's more like between $10,000 and $20,000, but that's still a really hefty bill for a small scale grower or a nonprofit organization to take on. There are a lot of places that offer connection to like a fire hydrant during the growing season as a water access pathway. But those policies might be unclear, discretionary, so people can have their permits approved 1 year and not the next year. And yeah, there's just lots of different little challenges that are associated with accessing water through these systems. And here again, we see the policy strategies, first and foremost as being kind of acknowledging the needs of urban agriculture and urban growers and finding ways to develop policies that are actually responsive to the conditions of the demands of urban farmers and gardeners on the water system. So we've seen, for example, cities who offer irrigation only rates for water versus in addition to a residential rate, or who provide stormwater diversion credits to urban farmers who are, serving as a sink for stormwater rather than putting more burden into the city stormwater system. Um, and yeah, so lots of other ways that cities and water utilities can accommodate and are accommodating urban producers. All right, number 5, chapter 6, are policies that address soils. So you need water, you need space, you also need healthy soil to grow food, almost always. Sometimes you need a shipping container and a lot of fancy equipment, but in most cases you need um, the earth or some facsimile thereof to grow food. Um, so urban soils are really different than soils in a traditional farm, sort of rural farm. Often folks are growing food on lots that were used for something else before. So that could have been a home, it could have been a parking lot, it could have been a baseball field. Um, but in any case, those soils are going to look generally really different from what sort of unintervened soil might look like in a more rural farm environment. Um, so not only are they potentially contaminated by previous uses, but they are impacted, compacted, lots have weird stuff in them, weird different kinds of fill. So there's lots of ways in which finding and developing soil that's suitable for agriculture is challenging within a city. Um, it can be really uh, difficult to figure out how to test your soil or to interpret that test once you've gotten it. Um, it can be really, you know, if you're looking for a space in the city that's big enough to grow a fair amount of food, that space may well be a brownfield, which is a site that has been contaminated in some way by a previous use. And then there are also, we see regulatory barriers to on-farm practices that build soil, like composting and cover cropping. Um, so in response to this, cities have developed several different types of policies that respond to these needs, including actually thinking about soil health as something that a city needs to be concerning themselves with and developing some kind of guidance for um, both city departments and for people who are trying to grow food in the city around how to address soil health concerns. So cities like Baltimore, which is outside of scope here, but I was just looking at it for a different reason, has like a soil safety plan for urban growers, for example. Um, and another way is to make sure that folks can access the history of what their land was used for. So, it's if you're looking, especially in the process of building a new farm, if you can look at a property record and see that that site was used as a gas station 20 years ago, you might try to take a different approach and use a different parcel to build your farm. And then the last thing is that cities can, this is zoning related, but develop strategies, both policy and programmatic, that make composting and other soil building and soil management practices more easy to access and more well supported by policy. So that can look like amending zoning codes to make composting explicitly legal. It can mean developing community compost or municipal compost programs that provide finished compost to urban farmers. It can look like passing cover cropping ordinances that make it really clear that cover crops are different than weeds and should be allowed to stand in place for months at a time, the period of time that it takes to overwinter usually. So again, lots of different strategies there. For our case study for soil health, we took a look at what Phoenix has done over the last several years. This isn't quite published yet, but it should be soon. So there are parts of Phoenix, particularly in South Phoenix, that see a lot of food insecurity, and they also have a lot of vacant and potentially contaminated land. This was a part of the city that was more heavily industrialized. There was more use as landfill or other kind of commercial or industrial uses. So the city took a look at this neighborhood and said, and knew about brownfields remediation funding that came from the federal government and the state government, and thought, well, why can't we combine these kind of needs and use this funding stream to develop these, redevelop these sites as urban agriculture and food access hubs. So this program has been going on for quite a while now, but today Phoenix leverages federal funding and state funding through their state EPA, and they also now have a dedicated revenue stream through the city government that helps them assess these potential urban agriculture sites and clean them up so that they can be put back into use as urban agriculture sites. And then our last topic area was innovative production. So a lot of a lot of the policy barriers are really similar to what we've already addressed in earlier sections. Innovative producers need access to water, they struggle with zoning, those kinds of things. But they have really unique needs, many of them, especially those that are higher tech or that look a little different than traditional soil-based agriculture. So again, our primary sort of strategy that we identified here as supporting innovative production through local policy was to just be inclusive, to explicitly address innovative production techniques in zoning codes or other city policies to allow for the installation of some of the structures that are associated with innovative production, like hoop houses, greenhouses, high tunnels, other accessory structures like shipping containers that are used as food production sites. And then, we've seen also that states and local governments have created various incentives or rate structures that have incentivized the development of innovative production operations and that have also sort of given them different rate structures for utilities like power and water, for example. So lots of different ways that cities and states are looking to support innovative producers. All right, so that's the conclusion of the sort of walk through that guide that I mentioned earlier and some of the case studies associated with it. And then the last thing that I want to talk about before we move on to the Q&A, and we're right on time, is our new local food policy resource hub. So this was a part of our original cooperative agreement with OUAIP. They charged us with creating a local food policy clearinghouse. So we worked with them and with I neglected to mention earlier that another important part of this project is that we've been working with an advisory group of urban ag practitioners and service providers throughout this whole process who have really been really vitally important in shaping how we develop these resources, what topics we addressed, all those things. But anyway, so we worked with them to figure out how to develop this sort of clearinghouse and landed on this structure, this three-part structure. So the first is a resource library, as I said earlier, which is a collection of resources, more sort of analytical resources on food systems law and policy. So again, these are things that we've published. They're also things that our colleagues at other organizations have published that, take a look at what local governments are doing around various types of food systems policy, provide recommendations, all the kind of stuff that we've just been talking about with urban agriculture, but with all different kinds of local food systems topics. And then there's also this big searchable policy database. So we've got more than 1,400 policies in here, again, on lots and lots of different policy topics, including urban agriculture. So many of the policies that we identified during our research for this project are included in this database, as well as topics like farm to school and emergency response, food emergency response, and farmers market regulation, those kinds of things. It's all searchable. There's lots of different kind of like tags that you can click into. You can see the beginnings of that list on the side. You can search by whether it's a state policy or a local policy. You can search within individual states. So we're hoping, we heard from a lot of folks as we started to sort of talk to more and more people about this project that often what local governments are looking for are sort of examples of other cities that have done similar things. So this we see this as a way of uh, a resource that we can offer to folks who are advocating for policy, policy updates or who are making those policy updates. Um, and then the third piece of it, which I don't have a photo for, is a policy technical assistance lab. So if you're a local government or a food system organization that's got a policy challenge that you could use some help with, we offer free legal and policy technical assistance. We've got a few sort of staff who are detailed to that lab who, you can sort of have a consultation with to talk through your policy or legal challenge. And that brings us to our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. So we have lots of comments that were included in the chat, which are super useful. So I would encourage for any of you who haven't taken a look at the chat to take a look at the chat to hear about some interesting things that are happening around the country. And we have one question for you, Liz. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to pop them in. But the question that we got was, do you have suggestions for ways to encourage cities to invest in community gardens, like through grant funding? This person works with residents in Bakersfield, California, who are very interested in community gardens and edible fruit trees, but the city often says they're underfunded and doesn't have the money to put into those types of programs.
Great question. Actually, one of the projects that has sort of come out of this project is I've been working with a group called the Urban Ag Directors Alliance, which is a group of municipal staff from around the country who work on these issues. They are right now working
They're
on,
here, some of them
yeah,
in the
uh,
chat. Yep.
and they're right now working on sort of responses to that very question, essentially. So looking at ways that cities, looking at sort of like the political dynamics behind how cities treat some of these issues and how cities might be pushed um, to support these programs a little more robustly, if at or at all, depending on where you are. I mean, I think it's very location specific. I'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation with you. But a lot of one of the things to know about these programs is they're pretty cheap to run, and the return on investment is like pretty high, both in terms of um, actual food security, so folks having, access to fresh food, healthy food, the ability to learn about how to grow food. All those things are really valuable, but they also provide really valuable sort of neighborhood infrastructure. So places where people can get to know their neighbors, can work towards a common goal with their neighbors. There are studies that show that these gardens can, increase public safety in neighborhoods around the garden spaces, or there's lots of other sort of ancillary social benefits. They experience, folks who are involved in these projects experience a greater sense of connection to their neighborhood. So there's lots and lots of reasons. I think it depends on what your particular city council members, what sort of line of argument your particular city council members are most open to. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Liz, we also got a question about whether or not any of the resources address, or if there's a case study that helps to demonstrate like the greatest return on investment that might be helpful for a large city like LA.
Um, Similar. I mean, that's again, I'm hoping that this UADA report that I'm contributing a tiny piece of will address some of those things. But that's something that city staff are really working on, identifying what the best metrics are to capture that return on investment. Right now, a lot of what cities look at when they do capture data around these growing spaces is like how many acres are in food production within the city, or how much produce is produced by these spaces. And that gives you our participation rates in some of these programs. And that gives you a really rough sense of how um, how these sites are important within neighborhoods, within cities. Um, but there aren't as many studies that are sort of more broad-based that, and again, I think it really depends on um, the political dynamics that you're working with and what kind of return the people that you're trying to convince will find most convincing, essentially. Whether that's, you know, job creation in the case of for-profit farms or nonprofit farms that hire folks and do workforce development on these sites, whether that's um, again, the sort of like public safety infrastructure. And by that, I mean like developing a sort of like positive sense of safety in communities because they're spending more time talking to their neighbors, they're spending more time um, working on the sort of positive project within their community.
Mm.
So there's lots and lots of ways that these spaces provide value that are outside of just, they're not, most urban farms are really small. They're not going to solve the food access challenges of a place like Los Angeles, but they can address some amount of food security and also a lot of sort of social cohesion and other kinds of community development dynamics. But yeah, for both of those questioners, I would keep an eye out for the work that UADA is doing right now. And if someone from UADA is in the room, you can drop the website in the chat so folks can follow along with that work. Do you,
Awesome.
do you have any questions, Lori?
Yeah, I have a question I could ask you.
Oh, and someone I just saw, sorry, I can finally see the chat. Environmental
Okay.
benefits of these spaces are also really important. So, um, the first one of the first being that they're permeable surfaces within cities. So, water sinks into the ground there instead of going into stormwater sewers or whatever. So there's lots of benefits to that. They also, in cities that are really heavily paved, there's something called the urban heat island effect, where localized temperatures in neighborhoods can be really high. And these spaces are green. They provide sort of like localized cooling for folks to have like a nice shady green place to go in their neighborhoods. Um, there's lots of other environmental stuff, but those are two big ones.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. So for the Philly case study that you discussed earlier that relied in large part on the state adverse possession reforms to be able to secure garden tenure, if there are cities, well, I guess one question is like, how does a city accomplish something like that? And if they can't accomplish something like that, are there other local level tools that would get close to that same level of security?
Mhm. Good question. I think the adverse possession pathway specifically is pretty much exclusively the province of state law across the
Mm.
country. So that one thing, you need to kind of go through the state to ensure that sort of like specific type of tenure for those specific types of gardens. So it's definitely not like a universally applicable land access strategy.
Mhm.
Um, I think that Philly was able to succeed in that campaign in large part because of how organized the community is. That's something that we see a common theme of is places where farmers and gardeners are really talking to each other and are connecting with each other, are the places where we see the most sort of progress being made in local and state level policy development. And Philly is definitely a place where people are for the most part, really connected to each other and working towards common goals often in these policy reform initiatives. As far as what cities can do to provide stable land tenure, I think there are lots there are lots of different types of programs that cities have put into place. Um, Even in Philly, for example, like Philly has a garden leasing program on city. Philly's full of parks. There's lots of parkland that They facilitate leases on for farms and gardens. Um, and we see those kinds of leasing programs in other cities throughout the country. So in some places, those leases might be really short, but in other places, just annual renewable leases. But other cities are starting to put into place longer 5, 10, 15-year leases that give gardeners much more security over their land. Um, in other places, we see that cities are transferring land permanently that they hold, that they have control over to urban farmers and gardeners. So, Chicago, for example, runs like an urban ag land sales program a couple times a year where they sell, they sort of like identify some lots within the city that are particularly well suited to urban agriculture and they sell them for $1
Mm.
to projects that qualifying projects essentially. And the sort of promise that the folks who buy those lots make is that they're going to keep those lots in urban agriculture for at least 10 years. So if they stop, if their farm is, whatever, they give up on farming or they decide that they want to do something else with that parcel, the city can come back and actually like take it back. So there's some protection in terms of ensuring that that's there, land speculators aren't taking advantage of that program, for example.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are just at time. Thank you so much, Liz. I always love to hear about this work and this project. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Special thanks to OUAIP for all the assistance and help and for making this project possible. So thank you all. Stay tuned. We'll certainly make this webinar available for you to be able to share to your networks. And stay tuned for the follow-up resources. There's still much more to come. And thank you. Have a great afternoon.